The first time Mabel Bell told someone she did not believe in love. She was 19 years old, standing over her mother's grave in the hard red dirt of Tucson, Arizona, in the summer of 1881, and she meant every single word of it. She had watched love destroy her mother. She had watched her father drink himself half to death after her mother passed, and she had watched her older sister, Clara, marry a man who smiled like a preacher and drank like a devil, and leave Mabel alone in the house with nothing but a leaky roof and a small plot of dry land that barely grew enough to keep a person breathing. She had seen what love did. She had catalogued its damages the way a physician catalogues wounds, carefully, thoroughly, without sentiment. Love was a fire that consumed everything it touched and left only ash and sorrow in its wake. So when Mabel Bell packed what little she owned into a worn leather saddlebag in the spring of 1883, she was 21 years old. She was sharp as a new blade. She was tired down to her bones, and she had made herself a promise that she intended to keep for the rest of her life. She would rely on no one. She would love no one. She would build something of her own with her own two hands, and she would not need a single soul to do it. The problem was that the land she had inherited from her father, when he finally drank his last drink the previous autumn, was 40 acres of rocky scrubland outside of a small town called Calico Creek, 3 days' ride northwest into the territory. She had never seen it. Her father had won it in a card game and had never thought enough of it to mention it until the handwritten deed turned up in his coat pocket after they buried him. The county clerk had confirmed it was legitimate. It was hers. And so Mabel Bell tied her saddlebag to the back of her brown mare, Dusty, pointed herself northwest, and rode toward the rest of her life with her jaw set, and her dark eyes fixed on the horizon like she was daring it to disappoint her. Calico Creek was the kind of town that looked like it had been dropped onto the desert floor by accident and had not yet decided whether to stay. There was a main street with a handful of buildings, a general store run by a heavyset man named Horace Finch who kept a cat on the counter, a saloon called the Copper Kettle that smelled of sawdust and sour whiskey, a small post office, a livery stable, and a sheriff's office that appeared to be occupied by a man who spent most of his time asleep in a chair on the front porch. There was a church at the end of the street, white-painted and earnest, and behind it a graveyard that was already respectably full. Mabel rode in on a Thursday afternoon in late April. The sun was hammering down on everything with the particular cruelty of an Arizona afternoon, and the dust on the street rose in little puffs around Dusty's hooves. Several men loitering outside the saloon turned to look at her as she rode past. She did not look back at any of them. She tied Dusty to the post outside the general store and went inside to ask Horace Finch where her land was. He told her, after studying her with the unself-conscious curiosity of a man who had seen very little in his life that interested him, that the Bell parcel was about 4 miles due east of town, past the old cedar breaks and down, along a creek fork that dried up in summer. He also told her, with what seemed like genuine concern, that the small cabin on that property had not been lived in for the better part of 3 years and might want some attending to. "I can handle a cabin," Mabel said. Horace Finch looked at her for a moment. "I don't doubt it," he said, and his tone suggested he actually did not. She bought flour, salt, dried beans, a box of matches, and a length of rope from Horace's store, loaded them into her saddlebag, and rode out to find her land. The cabin was worse than Horace had implied. One wall had partially caved in where a roof beam had given way, and the door hung on a single hinge. The stone fireplace at the far end was intact, which Mabel decided to count as a victory. The floorboards in the front room were warped and 2 of them were entirely missing. There were signs that some animal, probably a coyote or a family of raccoons, had taken up residence at some point, though they appeared to have moved on. The window openings had no glass, just 2 squares of darkness opening onto the scrub and the cedar trees beyond. Mabel stood in the middle of the single-room structure and took a long, measured breath and told herself it was fine. It was hers. That was enough. She had slept in worse. She spent the first 2 weeks working from sunup to near dark, hauling stones to shore up the broken wall, rehanging the door with leather hinges she cut herself, and pulling up the worst of the warped floorboards and replacing them with split cedar planks she cut from the trees along the creek fork. She was not a large woman, but she had the kind of wiry, efficient strength that comes from a lifetime of doing things for yourself. And she worked steadily and without complaint because there was no one around to complain to, and she would not have done it anyway. On a Saturday morning in early May, when she had been in Calico Creek for going on 3 weeks, she rode into town for more supplies and found herself standing in front of Horace's store behind a very tall man in a worn brown duster, who was in the middle of an argument with Horace about the price of a new bridle. The man was perhaps 24 or 25 years old. He had black hair that curled slightly at the ends where it touched his collar, and dark brown eyes, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something hard by someone who had strong opinions about the matter. He wore a dusty hat pushed back on his head and a holstered Colt at his hip that he wore with the casual ease of a man who had carried it a long time. His hands were large and rough, and he was gesturing with one of them as he made his argument about the bridle. $4 is criminal, Horace, and you know it, he was saying. That bridle is not worth $4, and I know it is not because I bought one just like it from the same maker in Benson last fall, and I paid $2.50. Prices go up, Raymond, Horace said serenely. That is the nature of commerce. The nature of commerce, the man called Raymond repeated, with the tone of a man who had strong feelings about that phrase. You mean the nature of taking advantage of people who are too far from the next town to have a choice. Same thing, often as not, Horace said pleasantly. Mabel set her basket on the counter and said, without particularly meaning to, he's right about the bridle for what it's worth. The same one is $2.50 in Benson and $2.75 in Tucson. I bought one last fall. Both men turned to look at her. Horace had the expression of a man who had been outflanked. Raymond had an expression that was harder to read, something between surprise and a slow-starting amusement. Well, Horace said after a moment, $3.25 then. That is my final word on the matter. $3 even, Raymond said. $3.10 and I will throw in a new length of lead rope, Horace said. Done, Raymond said. He picked up the bridle from the counter and then turned and looked at Mabel with a directness that was not rude but was entirely unguarded. I appreciate the help, he said. Raymond Graves. Mabel Bell, she said, and she shook his hand because that was what you did, and she noticed that his grip was careful rather than crushing, which she always thought said something about a person. You are the one fixing up the old Bell place, he said. It was not quite a question. I am the one who owns the Bell place, she said. Yes. Something in her tone apparently communicated clearly that there was a distinction being drawn, because he nodded without any particular surprise and said, I have the spread about 2 miles north of you. If you need anything, feel free to come by. He put his hat back on his head. Good day, Miss Bell. Good day, she said, and she watched him walk out of the store and did not think about him again for the rest of the afternoon. That was a lie, as it turned out, but she told it to herself convincingly enough that it functioned as the truth for a little while. Raymond Graves had come to Calico Creek 3 years earlier from a small town in New Mexico, where he had grown up on his father's cattle ranch, and learned that the land required everything you had and would still sometimes let you down. He had purchased a modest spread north of town, 120 acres with a serviceable house, a good barn, and a creek that ran most of the year, and he ran about 40 head of cattle with the help of one hand, a grizzled, largely silent man named Pete Dunbar who had been cowboying since before the war and had opinions about everything, but shared them only when he thought it necessary. Raymond was the kind of man who noticed things. He noticed the angle of light in the morning and what it meant for the day's weather. He noticed when his cattle were restless before a storm. He noticed that the new woman on the Bell place had been working sunrise to dark for 3 weeks solid and had not once come to anyone for help. And he noticed, though he was not quite sure why it struck him, that there was something in the way she held herself when she rode into town, straight-backed and clear-eyed, and with an expression that dared anyone to make assumptions, that made him feel like he was looking at something remarkable. He did not say this to Pete, because Pete would have had an opinion about it that Raymond was not quite ready to hear. 3 days after their meeting in the general store, a severe May thunderstorm rolled in from the west and hit the territory with the kind of enthusiasm that Arizona storms occasionally produced, lightning cracking the sky open and rain coming down in near-solid sheets for 6 hours straight. Raymond checked his stock, checked his barn roof, made sure Pete's quarters in the bunkhouse were holding, and then he stood at his window and looked out at the dark toward the southeast and thought about a cabin with a recently repaired wall and leather hinges on the door. In the morning, when the storm had passed and the sky was washed pale and new, he saddled his horse and rode the 2 miles south. Mabel was already up and outside when he came over the rise, and the sight that met him was not what he had feared. The cabin was standing. The wall he had worried about was intact. She was standing in front of the cabin with a broom, sweeping standing water off her porch with the methodical patience of a woman attending to a task, and she looked up when she heard his horse, and there was something in her face, just briefly, that looked like it might have been gratitude, before it shuddered away behind that clear-eyed composure. "Just coming to check if the storm did any damage," he said, stopping his horse a courteous distance from the porch. "Nothing significant," she said. "A section of the chinking on the north wall washed out. I have already packed it back in." He looked at the north wall. She had indeed repacked the chinking. It looked competent. "You were up early," he said. "I am always up early," she said. "The work does not wait." He nodded. He could respect that. He had grown up with that same understanding, that the land's demands did not adjust themselves to your preferences or your exhaustion or your grief. "Well," he said. "Good." He started to turn his horse. "Mr. Graves," she said, and her voice had shifted just slightly, shed just a fraction of its armor. "I appreciate you coming to check. That was decent of you." He looked back at her. "It is what neighbors do," he said simply, and he rode home. Over the following weeks, as the Arizona spring hardened slowly toward summer, a pattern established itself between them that neither of them fully acknowledged. He would ride into town on Saturdays, and she would often be there for supplies, and they would fall into step or fall into conversation, and the conversation was never small. Mabel Bell did not traffic in small talk. She had opinions about the price of beef cattle, about the territorial water rights disputes that were making life difficult for small landholders, about the best way to replant a failing vegetable patch in dry soil, and she was not shy about expressing them. Raymond found this delightful in a way he found difficult to explain. She found him infuriating in a way she found equally difficult to explain. He was too easy to talk to. He listened when she spoke, and he actually seemed to hear what she said and respond to it rather than simply waiting for his turn, which was not, in her experience, how men generally operated. He was funny in a dry, understated way that crept up on you. And he looked at her like she was a person worth looking at, not like she was a problem to be managed or a curiosity to be cataloged. She found herself being careful. That was the only word for it. She was careful around him the way you are careful around a fire that is warm enough to be tempting. In June, her east-facing field, which she had been trying to prepare for a late planting of corn and beans, hit a layer of caliche, the hard, lime-rich soil layer that defeated many a farmer's shovel, at barely 8 inches depth. She spent 2 days attempting to break through it herself, and got through perhaps a third of the 50-yard row before her shoulders and wrists informed her with some authority that they had reached their limit. She was sitting on the fence post at the edge of her field on the evening of the second day, rubbing her wrists and contemplating the remaining 2/3 of the problem, when she heard a horse on the track that ran past her property. Raymond pulled up and leaned on his saddle horn and looked at the field and looked at her wrists and looked at the field again. "Calici," he said. "8 inches," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have a mule-drawn breaking plow that will handle it," he said. "I could bring it over Tuesday morning if you want." She looked at the field. She looked at her wrists. She was practical enough to recognize a genuine offer of assistance, and she was realistic enough about her own limitations today, right now, with her hands aching and the light failing, to know that she needed it. "I can trade you a day's fence work," she said. "I noticed your north pasture fence is running short of posts along the creek bend." He looked at her for a moment with something that might have been surprise and might have been something else entirely. "Deal," he said. "Tuesday morning." "Tuesday morning," she confirmed. He brought the plow and his mule, a placid animal named Abraham, and they worked together for most of that Tuesday, him driving the plow through the caliche layer and her following behind, breaking up the loosened hardpan with a mattock, and by late afternoon the field was done. She made coffee over the fireplace and brought it outside, and they sat on the porch steps and drank it while the evening color moved across the desert and the coyotes started up their hollow song somewhere in the cedar breaks. "How long have you been ranching?" she asked. "Since I was 14, he said. "My father's spread in New Mexico. I left when I was 21. Came here and started over." "Why here?" He thought about it with the honesty of a man who has already decided not to give the easy answer. "Because it was far enough from what I was leaving that it felt like a genuine beginning," he said, "and because the land looked like something that could be shaped if a person was willing to put the work in." She looked out at the desert, the last light turning the red stone to gold. "I know something about that," she said. "I expect you do," he said. There was a silence between them that was comfortable in a way that surprised her, because silences with people she did not know well almost never were. She filed this observation away in the careful part of her mind and decided not to examine it too closely. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said. "What made you come here, to this place, this land you had never seen?" She thought about her mother's grave in the hard red dirt. She thought about her father's coat pocket and the deed that had come out of it. She thought about Clara's husband with his preacher smile. "It was mine," she said. "Just mine. Nobody gave it to me, and nobody lent it to me, and nobody is going to take it away. That is enough reason." He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, like that answer satisfied something in him. "That is a good reason." She went to repay the fence work on Thursday of that week, as she had promised. She was good at the work, measuring the post spacing by eye with an accuracy that made Pete Dunbar, who was helping that day, grunt approvingly. Pete did not give approval lightly. Raymond caught her eye over Pete's head and gave her a small, genuine smile, and she looked away before whatever was starting to happen in her chest could progress any further. She was not falling in love with Raymond Graves. She was not doing that. She had made herself a promise, and she intended to keep it. The trouble was that July came, and with it, a sequence of events that did not care at all about her promises. It started with a man named Decker Cole. Decker Cole had arrived in Calico Creek sometime in May, not long after Mabel, and had set himself up as a land speculator. He was a lean, well-dressed man in his late 30s who wore a town suit in an environment that did not call for one, and who had a way of smiling that made Mabel think, the first time she met him, of her sister's husband. He had been, over the preceding weeks, approaching small landholders in and around Calico Creek with offers to buy their property, and several of them, ground down by drought and debt, and the particular exhaustion of trying to make something grow in hostile soil, had sold. In the first week of July, he arrived at Mabel's cabin in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, riding a bay horse with a well-oiled saddle that must have cost more than Mabel's entire livestock situation, and he presented himself at her door and offered to buy her 40 acres. Mabel stood in her doorway and listened to his offer, which was respectful in its phrasing and insultingly low in its dollar amount, and she said, "No thank you, Mr. Cole. This land is not for sale." He adjusted his smile to something more generous. "Miss Bell, I appreciate your attachment to the property. But I think if you consider the realities of your situation, a woman alone on a piece of ground that will not grow much, that will not break your back, you might find that a clean sale and a fresh start elsewhere is the more sensible option." "I did not invite your assessment of my situation," Mabel said, and her voice was very steady. "I told you the land is not for sale. Good day." He looked at her for one long moment with an expression that was not quite threatening but was in that neighborhood. "I hope you will think on it, Miss Bell. I plan to be in this territory a good while longer. There is always time for reconsideration." He rode off. Mabel went inside and stood very still for a moment, and then she made herself a cup of coffee and drank it and told herself she was not worried. She told Raymond about it the following Saturday, not because she was asking for help, but because it seemed like information that a neighbor in the same territory ought to have. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to recognize as his particular quality, and when she finished his jaw had done something complicated. "He has approached half the landholders south of the creek," Raymond said. "Old Emmett Pierce sold to him last month, the Hartley family the month before that. I do not know what he plans to do with the land, but it is not going to benefit anyone who lives here." "Has he approached you?" Mabel asked. "3 times, Raymond said. "I told him each time what you told him." She looked at him. "What does Sheriff Hallett say about it?" Raymond's expression told her everything before he said a word. Sheriff Hallett, the sleeping man in the porch chair, was a decent enough soul who had held his position for 15 years on the strength of the fact that Calico Creek had historically not required much active lawkeeping. He was not, Raymond implied gently, the kind of man who could be relied upon to handle something that required legal ingenuity and determination. "We need to find out what he is actually planning," Mabel said. "Because if he is buying up enough land to control the water access along the creek system, then every remaining landowner in this area is going to be in serious trouble within 2 or 3 years. Raymond looked at her with an expression she would later be able to identify as the moment things shifted between them, though she would not know it until much later. He was looking at her like she had just said something he had been thinking and had not found the precise words for, like she had taken the scattered pieces of his concern and arranged them into something clear. "You are right," he said. "That is exactly what he is doing." "Then we need to do something about it," she said. What they did was this. Over the following 2 weeks, they visited every remaining small landholder in the area between them, Mabel riding south and east, Raymond riding north and west, talking to families and single operators and retired cowpunchers who had staked a few acres, explaining what they had figured out about Cole's strategy. Not everyone listened. Some of them had already received offers and were tempted, because the reality of small farming in dry Arizona territory was genuinely brutal, and the temptation of a cash payment, even an unfair one, was not nothing. But enough of them listened, and enough of them were angry enough to act. They arranged a meeting at the Calico Creek Church on a Wednesday evening, and 12 families came. Mabel spoke first, because Raymond had asked her to, and she laid out the situation with the clear, plain logic that was her natural mode: the water access issue, the pattern of Cole's purchases, the likely long-term consequences. Then Raymond spoke and laid out what they could do, as a collective, to protect themselves, including filing a formal water rights claim with the territorial office in Tucson that would document all of their existing access and make any future manipulation much more legally complicated. Standing in that little white church watching Raymond speak, watching the way the families in the pews gradually shifted from worried to something approaching resolve, Mabel felt something move through her that she did not immediately recognize because she had spent a long time making sure she did not feel it. It was not admiration exactly, although there was admiration in it. It was something more specific and more dangerous. It was the feeling of watching someone you trust entirely carry something heavy and carry it well. She did not name it. She turned her eyes away from him and looked at her hands in her lap and told herself, very firmly, that she was simply glad to have a competent neighbor. They rode back from the church together in the early dark of the July night, their horses walking side by side on the narrow track between the cedar brakes, and for a long while neither of them said anything. The sky above them was extraordinary, as Arizona sky often is, thick with stars and with the Milky Way laid across it like a spilled thing, and the desert smelled of rain that had fallen somewhere north of them and was not coming here. "You did well in there tonight," Raymond said finally. "We both did," she said. "No," he said. "You turned the room. When you started talking they were scared and uncertain, and by the time you finished they were ready to act. That is not a small thing." She was quiet for a moment. She was not accustomed to being credited with things she had done, not specifically, not by someone who was paying enough attention to make the credit meaningful. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out slightly different than she intended. He glanced at her. The moonlight was strong enough that she could see his face. He was looking at her with that unguarded directness that she had never quite gotten used to, and there was something in his expression that was open and serious and quietly, entirely certain, and her heart did something that she would very much have preferred it not to. "Miss Bell," he said, and then stopped. He was quiet for 2 full beats. "Mabel," he said, and the way he said her name was different from the way anyone else said it, like it was a word worth saying carefully. "Don't," she said, and her voice was gentle but it was final. He looked at the track ahead and did not say what he had been about to say. "All right," he said. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and when they reached the point where the track forked, north toward his place and east toward hers, he touched the brim of his hat and said good night, and she said good night, and they separated. She did not sleep much that night. In the morning she was up before the sun and working in her field, which had come in with something approaching enthusiasm since the breaking of the caliche layer, and the beans were climbing their poles and the corn was knee-high, and the work had the particular satisfaction of having converted effort into visible result. She worked until the heat became unreasonable, and then she went inside and sat at her table, and had the honest conversation with herself that she had been postponing. She knew what was happening. She was not a foolish woman, and she was not an unaware one. She knew that Raymond Graves had come to mean something to her in the 4 months since she had ridden into Calico Creek. She knew that she looked for him on Saturdays in town without letting herself fully admit that she was looking. She knew that the Tuesday morning they had worked her field together had been one of the best days she had spent in memory. She knew all of this. She also knew what love did. She knew its capacity for destruction. She knew her mother's face in the last years, worn down to something translucent by a love that had given everything and been given back grief. She knew her sister's life. She knew the cost. She sat at her table for a long time, and then she got up and went back to work, because the work was something she could control and the thing sitting in her chest was not. The water rights filing went to Tucson at the end of July, signed by 11 of the 12 families and by both Raymond and Mabel. Decker Cole appeared at Mabel's door one more time in early August, and this time his smile was entirely absent and his tone had some gravel in it. "You have made things complicated," he said. "I have made things legal," she said, "which is a different thing." "I wonder if you understand what kind of man I am," he said. "I understand exactly what kind of man you are," she said, and she held his gaze until he looked away first, and then she closed her door, and she leaned against the inside of it and breathed slowly and steadily and waited until she heard his horse leave before she let herself shake a little. She told Raymond about it the next day when she saw him at the store. His face did a number of things in sequence: concern first, then anger, then something quieter and more serious underneath both of those. "He is not going to do anything that risks his business reputation in front of a territorial filing," Raymond said, and his voice was measured and deliberate, the way a person sounds when they are working to stay measured and deliberate. "But I do not want you riding out there alone at night for a while. I am capable of looking after myself," she said, and meant it. "I know you are," he said with complete sincerity. "I am asking for my own peace of mind, not for yours. There is a difference." She looked at him. He looked back. His peace of mind, he had said, without embarrassment or evasion, just stating it plain. She turned away and picked up the flower she had come for and said, "I will be careful." Decker Cole, as it turned out, was a man who preferred legal maneuvering to physical confrontation, and when it became clear that the water rights filing was solid and that the collective of landholders had found a decent territorial lawyer in Tucson to advise them, he shifted his strategy. He stopped approaching people with direct purchase offers and instead began applying pressure through debt, buying up the notes on two of the smaller operations whose owners were behind on their payments to the bank in Benson. This was, legally speaking, his right, and it put two families in genuine difficulty. Raymond and Mabel, together with the rest of the collective, spent the better part of September finding solutions. Raymond contributed 6 months of his own cash reserves to help one of the families, the Henrys, refinance their note at a better rate through a Tucson lender they had been connected to by the lawyer. Mabel organized the women in the collective to help the second family, the Garcias, bring in their harvest early and sell at market before Cole could move to foreclose, generating enough revenue to clear their immediate debt. September was an exhausting month. Mabel rode more miles than she could count. She had meetings in the back of Horace's store and at kitchen tables across the territory. She wrote letters to the territorial newspaper in Tucson about water rights and predatory land speculation, and 2 of those letters were printed. She also kept her own farm going, because her farm did not stop requiring attention because she was busy with other things. On an evening in late September, Raymond appeared at her door for the first time since she had moved in. Not at the road, not passing by, but at the door, with his hat in his hand and his expression carrying something careful and deliberate. "I brought supper," he said, and held up a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Pete makes a remarkable rabbit stew when he is in the mood, and he was in the mood this evening." She looked at him for a moment. The practical part of her recognized that she had not eaten a proper meal since morning, and that her larder was running low because she had been too busy to restock it. The less practical part of her recognized what it meant that he was standing at her door with his hat in his hand. "Come in," she said. He came in and sat at her table, and she got bowls from the shelf, and they ate Pete's rabbit stew, which was indeed remarkable, and they talked about the Henry family refinancing and the Garcia harvest, and whether the letter to the Tucson paper was going to generate any useful attention. They talked for 2 hours without running out of things to say, and at the end of it, the light outside had gone fully dark, and the stars were out, and neither of them had mentioned Decker Cole for the last 20 minutes. "Can I tell you something?" Raymond said, and his voice had changed from the easy conversational tone of the last 2 hours into something quieter and more deliberate. She looked at him across the table. "You can tell me anything you want," she said. "I am not obligated to do anything about it." The corner of his mouth turned up very slightly. "That is a fair condition," he said. He looked at his hands on the table. "I have been careful not to say certain things to you because you have made it clear that you do not want them said, and I respect that. I want you to know that I respect it completely." He looked up at her. "But I also want you to know that it does not change anything for me. What I think about you, and what you have come to mean to me in these months. I am not telling you this to pressure you. I am telling you because I think you deserve to know that someone in this world thinks you are remarkable." The silence in the cabin was total. Outside, something was moving in the cedar breaks, a night sound, and the candle on the table made the shadows move. "Raymond," she said, and her voice came out more unsteady than she wanted. "You do not have to say anything," he said. "I meant what I said. I am not asking for anything." "I do not believe in love," she said. It came out like the thing it was, something she had said to herself so many times it had become a kind of shelter. "I have watched what it does. I have seen the damage of it. It takes people and wears them down to nothing and leaves them hollow." He was quiet for a moment, He looked at her with that clear, unhurried gaze. "I know it can," he said. "I know that is true. I have seen it too," a pause. "But I do not think that is the only thing it is." "That has been my experience," she said. "Then let me give you a reason to start," he said. The words landed very quietly in the room. He said them without drama, without grand gesture, without the performed quality of a man making a speech. He said them the way a person states something they have thought about carefully and arrived at honestly. And they went directly through every careful wall she had built, not demolishing them, not tearing them apart, but passing through them like light through glass, reaching something underneath. She sat very still. He did not push. He did not lean forward or reach across the table. He sat where he was and let the words do what they were going to do and waited for her. "That is a very large promise," she said finally. "I know it is," he said. "I am not easy," she said. "I am not going to change who I am or how I work or what I need to make a different kind of person comfortable." "I know that too," he said. "I would not want you to." She looked at him for a long time. She was looking at him the way she had learned to look at a piece of land, reading its character, looking for what was real beneath the surface. What she saw was a man who was present, entirely present, in the way that very few people she had ever met were present, who was looking back at her with complete honesty, and without any of the performance or maneuvering that she had learned to watch for and distrust. She thought about her mother. She thought about Clara. She thought about what love had cost the people she had watched it take. And then she thought about the last 5 months. She thought about Tuesday mornings and Saturday afternoons and rabbit stew, and riding home in the dark under the enormous Arizona stars, and the way he had said, without embarrassment, that he was asking for his own peace of mind, not hers. She thought about standing in the church watching him turn a room full of frightened people into something resolute. She thought about his hands on the fence posts and the way he listened, and the fact that in 5 months she had never once caught him pretending to be something he was not. "All right," she said, and the words surprised her coming out, as if a part of her had made the decision slightly ahead of the conscious part. "All right. But I reserve the right to be frightened. I would not take that away from you," he said. He smiled then fully, and it transformed his face in a way that she had seen glimpses of before, but not like this, not aimed entirely at her, and she thought, with a clarity that was both alarming and somehow peaceful, that she was in very serious trouble, and that for the first time in a long time she was not entirely opposed to it. He left shortly after, with a courteous good night that honored exactly what had and had not been said, and she stood on her porch for a long time after the sound of his horse faded and looked at the stars, and breathed and told herself she was still herself. She was still Mabel Bell. This did not change that. October in southern Arizona has a particular quality, the heat's grip loosening degree by degree, the sky going to a deeper blue, the mornings sharp and bright with a cold that carries intention. Mabel noticed it the way she always noticed the seasons' changes, practically, in terms of what it meant for her tasks, but also that October, with a heightened attention she could not entirely attribute to the weather. Things between her and Raymond did not dramatically transform overnight. What they did was deepen, carefully, like water working its way into stone. He came to supper on Thursdays. She came to his place on Sunday afternoons when her week's work allowed it, and they would ride the boundary of his land together and talk about the cattle market, and the land and the books they had both been reading. Because it turned out Raymond Graves read whenever he could get a hold of something worth reading, which was one more thing about him that she had not expected and could not entirely accommodate in the comfortable distance she had tried to maintain. One Sunday afternoon in October, she arrived at his place to find him in the small vegetable plot behind his house, on his knees in the dirt, attempting to save what remained of a fall planting of beets that had been hammered by something, birds or ground squirrels. He was not sure which. She tied Dusty to the post and went to investigate, and they spent an hour side by side putting wire guards around the remaining plants, And there was something in the ordinary intimacy of kneeling in the dirt together, the easy companionship of a shared and unimportant task, that cracked something open in her chest without warning. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and he was focused on the last wire cage, his hands moving carefully, and the afternoon light was on the side of his face, and something rose up in her so cleanly and completely that she was not able to stop it or redirect it or put it somewhere safer. "Raymond," she said. He looked up. She did not say anything for a moment. She was not sure what she would have said. But he was looking at her with that clear, open attention, and she had the sudden, absolute knowledge that he would wait as long as she needed, that there was no urgency here, no pressure, no condition attached to his patience. And that knowledge, that specific knowledge, undid something in her more completely than anything else could have. "I am starting to believe you," she said, "for what it is worth." He was very still for a moment. Then he said quietly, "It is worth everything to me." He did not reach for her or close the distance between them, not then. He just looked at her with that expression, the one she had been trying not to name for months, and it was entirely tender and entirely certain, and she felt it land in her like something coming home. She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the wire cage, and his hand turned under hers and held it, and they stayed that way in the dirt of his vegetable garden, while the afternoon light moved on the desert and the mountains to the south turned purple, and it was possibly the most honest and unguarded moment of her adult life. He walked her to her horse when the light began to fail, and at Dusty's side he looked at her with a question that was not quite a question, and she looked back at him, and he leaned in slowly and she did not step back, and he kissed her once, gently and without hurry, the kind of kiss that is a statement of intent rather than a claim, and she put her hand against his chest briefly and felt the solid, steady beat of his heart. And then she stepped back and mounted Dusty and rode home with the evening wind and something large and warm and terrifying living in her chest. She was not afraid of it precisely. She was aware of it the way you are aware of something that has fundamentally changed the landscape, not frightened, but recalibrating, finding the new shape of things. Decker Cole made one final significant move in November. Having lost the water rights battle and failed to acquire enough land to control the creek system, he attempted to discredit the territorial filing through a legal challenge, claiming procedural errors in how the collective's lawyer had submitted the documentation. It was a thin challenge, and the collective's lawyer was confident it would fail, but thin challenges still required answering, and the answering required money for legal fees that most of the small landholders did not have easily available. Raymond and Mabel organized a fundraising effort. There was a dance held at the church on a Friday evening in November, admission a dime, with music provided by 3 local men who played fiddle and guitar, and something that was supposed to be a harmonica, but sounded more like a confused animal in distress. It raised more than $20. More importantly, the letter Mabel had written to the Tucson paper had generated a response from a territorial lawyer who was interested in the water rights angle as a test case for broader policy, and he agreed to represent the collective's position on the legal challenge at a significantly reduced rate in exchange for the precedent value if they won. They won. The challenge was dismissed in early December, and Decker Cole, apparently calculating that his profit margin on this particular venture had been sufficiently eroded, packed his well-oiled saddle onto his bay horse in the second week of December and rode out of Calico Creek and did not come back. Horace Finch reported, with some satisfaction, that Cole had settled his account at the general store before leaving and had not left a forwarding address. The collective held a small celebration in the back room of the Copper Kettle Saloon, which was the only space in Calico Creek large enough to hold all 11 families and several assorted individuals, including Pete Dunbar, who drank 2 glasses of whiskey and then fell asleep in a chair, which everyone considered fitting. There was food and noise and genuine happiness, the kind that comes from having held something together against a real force trying to pull it apart. Mabel stood at the edge of the room watching it and felt something she recognized, after a moment, as belonging. She had not expected that. She had come to Calico Creek alone and had intended to remain in the particular solitude that self-sufficiency builds, and somewhere in the last 8 months she had become part of a place. Not just a landholder on 40 acres east of town, but a person who was woven into the fabric of the community, whose opinion was sought and whose effort was appreciated, and who belonged, genuinely belonged, to something larger than herself. Raymond appeared at her shoulder. He handed her a glass of lemonade which Horace had provided as a concession to those who did not drink, and stood beside her looking at the room. "We did that," he said. "They did it," she said. "We just helped them see that they could." "Same thing," he said, and she heard her own words to him from months ago echoed back, and she turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and his expression had that quality again, the one she had learned to trust. "Raymond," she said. "Mabel," he said. "I believe in love," she said. She said it quietly, just for him, just in this corner of the noisy room. "I want you to know that. I know what I said. I know I meant it when I said it. But I was wrong about the whole of it, even if I was right about some of it." She stopped, started again. "What I have watched destroy people is not the same thing as this. What my mother had, what my sister has, that was love used badly or given to the wrong place. I thought it was love itself that was the danger, but you showed me it is not the same thing." She looked at him steadily. "You showed me it can be this instead." He was very quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was slightly different from its usual calm. "I have been in love with you since you backed me up about that bridal," he said, and the thing that was funny about that made her laugh, a real laugh, surprised and warm, and he smiled with his whole face. "That was a perfectly reasonable position about the bridal," she said. "You are a perfectly reasonable woman," he said, "and entirely extraordinary." She looked at him, at this man who had shown up at her door with rabbit stew, and at her fence posts with his mule, and at her side in every difficult thing the last 8 months had produced, and she let herself feel it completely, the full unreserved weight of what she felt for him, without flinching away from it or managing it down to something safer. "I love you," she said. It came out clear and steady. He reached over and took her hand. His grip was careful, as it always was, and warm and entirely certain. "I love you," he said back. Around them, the room continued its celebration, and the fiddle player started up something lively, and Pete Dunbar snored gently in his chair, and Mabel Bell stood in the corner of the Copper Kettle Saloon in Calico Creek, Arizona, in the year 1883, holding the hand of Raymond Graves, and she thought that she had been wrong about love for a long time, and she was profoundly glad that she had been given a reason to start again. He asked her to marry him on Christmas Eve, which arrived in Calico Creek with a cold that had come down from the north, and a sky that was the particular white-gray of a sky considering snow, something that did not happen often in southern Arizona, and which gave the day a quality of unreality, as if the ordinary rules had been temporarily suspended. He did not do it with dramatic staging or elaborate speech. He came to her cabin in the morning with fresh bread that Pete had made, because Pete turned out to be a man of unexpected domestic skills, and a small paper-wrapped package, and after coffee and conversation she opened the package and found inside it a ring that had been his grandmother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, and she looked at it for a moment and then looked at him. "I want to be very clear about what I am offering," he said, in that careful, deliberate way of his. "I am not asking you to become something other than what you are. I am not asking you to give up your land or your independence or any part of who you have built yourself into. I am asking to be beside you, that is all, just beside you for as long as you will have me." She looked at the ring and then at him and then at the ring again. The cabin was warm from the fire, and outside the sky had made up its mind, and small, uncertain snowflakes were beginning to fall on the desert, and the whole thing had the quality of something she would remember in precise detail for the rest of her life. "Yes," she said, Obviously, yes. He put the ring on her finger and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw and kissed him, properly, completely. The way you kiss someone when the careful distance between you has finally closed for good. And outside the snow was coming down on Calico Creek, on the dry red land and the cedar breaks and the creek fork and the 40 acres that were hers and the 120 acres 2 miles north that were his. And it was the most beautiful and impractical thing the desert had done in years. They were married in the Calico Creek church on a Saturday afternoon in February of 1884, which was Raymond's choice of timing, because he said he intended to have the rest of the calendar year to begin learning how to be her husband, and they should not waste any of it. Reverend Michaels, who was a small, myopic man with a large heart, presided. The congregation was every family from the collective and half the town besides, and Horace Finch brought his store cat, which sat in the front pew and regarded the proceedings with complete feline indifference. Pete Dunbar wore a clean shirt for the occasion and looked simultaneously proud and deeply uncomfortable, which was, everyone agreed, exactly right for Pete. There were flowers, which Mabel and the Garcia girls had gone out at dawn to find, and had come back with armfuls of desert blooms, yellows and purples, that they arranged without ceremony but with genuine skill. Mabel wore a dress she had made herself over the preceding weeks from a length of dark blue fabric she had ordered specially from the Tucson dry goods supplier. It was not elaborate, but it was exactly what she would have chosen, well-made and honest, and entirely her own. She walked up the aisle by herself, because there was no one to give her away and she had not needed giving away, and the independence of that walk, which Reverend Michaels might have privately considered unconventional, struck most of the people watching as entirely consistent with who Mabel Bell was. She stood before Raymond at the front of the little white church and looked at him, this man in his clean coat with his black hair curling slightly at his collar, and his dark eyes fixed on her with that complete and unguarded attention, and she felt no fear. She had expected to feel some. She had spent so long understanding love as a source of danger that she had expected the formal claiming of it to produce at least some residue of the old warning. But standing here, in this moment, with this man, there was only the steady warmth of certainty. She said her vows with a clear voice and meant every word of them as she said them, which she understood was not the case for everyone, and which she considered the most important part. He said his vows in a voice that was slightly thicker than usual, which was the only indication she ever received that Raymond Graves was not entirely immune to ceremony, and she filed it away with the tenderness that was by now entirely natural to her when it came to him. When Reverend Michaels said they could kiss, she reached up and put both hands on either side of Raymond's face and kissed him while the congregation of Calico Creek made the kind of collective noise that a genuinely happy audience makes, warm and slightly rowdy, and Pete Dunbar blew his nose into his clean handkerchief. They spent their first night as a married couple in Raymond's house, which was larger and more practical than her cabin, and they had discussed at length and decided that this would be their primary home while maintaining her land under cultivation, which made both economic and practical sense. She moved her things over on Sunday, which took less time than she expected because she had never accumulated much, and by Sunday evening, the house had acquired a quality she recognized after a moment as being the quality of a home where two actual people intended to live. She stood in the kitchen of the house where she would now live and looked around at it, and Raymond appeared in the doorway and leaned against the frame and watched her. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That I am going to need more shelves," she said. He laughed, a full open laugh, and she turned and looked at him and thought, for the 100th time and with the same freshness as the first, that she was unreservedly glad to be here. The spring of 1884 was a good one in the territory. The winter rains had come at the right times and the water table was up, and the cattle on Raymond's spread came through in better condition than the previous year, and Mabel's fields, tended with the same careful efficiency as always but now with occasional help from Raymond and Pete, produced a yield that was genuinely satisfying. The corn especially did well, taller than the year before, the rows straight and dense. She rode her 40 acres every few days to check on the cabin, which she was keeping in repair against any future need, and to work the fields. Raymond sometimes rode with her in the evenings when the day's work on his spread was done, and she appreciated both the company and the fact that he never once suggested that the land was less important now, or that she might want to let it lie fallow for a season, or any of the dozens of small diminishments that a different kind of man might have offered dressed up as practical advice. It was her land. He understood that without being told. In May of 1884, she told him she was expecting. She told him on the porch, in the evening, with the same directness she applied to everything, just the fact and her own clear-eyed awareness of what it meant for the next several months of work. He was quiet for a moment, and then he stood up from his chair and came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression that undid her entirely, something so full of love and gratitude and seriousness that she had to breathe through it. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am perfectly fine," she said. "I am not an invalid." "I know you are not," he said. "That was not what I asked." She looked at him. "I am happy," she said, and the simplicity of it surprised her, because happy was not a word she had used casually about herself in a long time. "Good," he said. He kissed her forehead with a gentleness that was not delicate in the way that implied fragility, but gentle in the way that implies someone is being treasured. "Then so am I." She worked her farm through the summer with adjustments to what she was willing to strain herself over, not because Raymond told her to, but because she made her own decisions about it. He worked alongside her more than before, not hovering, not managing, just present. Pete Dunbar showed up one morning in June with a chair he had made in the evenings, a rocking chair with a wide flat seat and good solid arms, and set it on the porch without comment and went back to the bunkhouse. And Raymond told her afterward that Pete had been working on it for 3 weeks and had redone the armrests twice because the first version was not quite right. She went and found Pete in the bunkhouse that evening and said, simply, "Thank you, Pete. It is perfect." Pete looked at his boots and said, "Well," which was Pete's way of saying "you are welcome," and she had come to know him well enough by then to understand that. The baby came in the first week of February of 1885, which meant that Calico Creek had its second winter in a row, and the sky had done its white-gray considering snow act again, which Mabel thought was appropriate. The labor was long and honest, and she got through it with the practical determination she brought to every hard thing, with the help of Mrs. Garcia and Mrs. Henry, who had both brought more children into the world than she could count, and Raymond, who she had told beforehand could stay or go as he preferred, and who had stayed and held her hand through the hardest hours without flinching once. The baby was a boy. They named him Thomas after Raymond's father, who was a good man who had died the previous year, and had never met his son's wife, which was a sorrow. Thomas was a large, loud, excellent baby who had his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn jaw, and Raymond held him in the first hour with the expression of a man who had not entirely anticipated that love could do this to you, could arrive in this concentrated and immediate form, this small demanding fact of a person, and find every available room in you. Mabel watched Raymond hold their son and felt something complete in her chest. Not the absence of fear, exactly. Not the absence of the old understanding that love was dangerous and costly, but the understanding that it was also this specific and irreplaceable this, and that the cost and the gift were not separable, and that she would choose it every time. She said so as directly as she did everything. "I would do all of it again," she said, from the bed where Mrs. Garcia had settled her. "All of it, every hard part." Raymond looked up from Thomas. "Including the bridal," he said. "Starting with the bridal," she said. Thomas grew at the speed that babies grow, which is to say alarming and constant, and by his first birthday he was walking in the unstable, committed fashion of new walkers everywhere. across the floors of the house where his parents had decided to live and love each other, and build something real in the dry, beautiful, demanding territory of southern Arizona. Life continued the way life does, in the accumulation of ordinary days that do not feel historic while they are happening, but in retrospect constitute the whole of a person's meaning. There were good years and hard years in the way that farming and ranching always produce. There was a bad drought in the summer of 1886 that cut the cattle herd and the field yields and required the careful management of everything they had. There was the year that the creek fork on Mabel's 40 acres finally gave out entirely in summer, which she had always known might happen, and the adjustment of her farming plan to account for it. There was the year that Pete Dunbar's health began to decline, and Raymond quietly reduced his workload and hired a young hand named Marcus Webb to carry what Pete could no longer carry, and Mabel and Mrs. Garcia took turns providing Pete with meals, and Pete accepted this with the gruff dignity of a man who knows he is cared for and does not have the words for what that means to him. Pete died in the spring of 1888 in his bunkhouse in the night, quietly. They buried him in the Calico Creek churchyard, and Raymond stood over the grave with his hat in his hand for a long time without speaking, and Mabel stood beside him and put her hand in his, and they did not talk because there was nothing to say that would be better than the saying of his name in silence. By 1888, Thomas was 3 years old and extraordinarily opinionated, a quality that both his parents found exasperating and secretly delightful. And in the autumn of that year, Mabel told Raymond she was expecting again. Their second child, a girl they named Clara Rose, after Mabel's sister, and after the late-season roses that grew inexplicably along the south-facing wall of the house, arrived in April of 1889, small and fierce and given. It was apparent from the first weeks, to studying the world around her with a solemn attention that Raymond said was exactly her mother and Mabel said was exactly her father, and both of them were right. Clara Rose was born into a household that was complete in all the ways that households can be. There was work and there was love, and there was the kind of daily partnership that is not the stuff of grand gestures, but is the actual architecture of a shared life. Two people who respected each other's competence and trusted each other's judgment, and told each other the truth, and in the evenings when the children were asleep, and the work was done for the day, sat together on the porch in Pete's rocking chair and Raymond's old chair beside it, and watched the desert go through its nightly transformation, and were at peace. The collective they had helped build in those early difficult years of 1883 had held together and grown. The water rights precedent from the coal case had been cited in 2 subsequent territorial cases and had contributed to policy changes that Mabel had heard about from the lawyer who had handled it, and she held this knowledge quietly and with satisfaction. The families who had been part of it were still there, still farming and ranching and making things work in the difficult, beautiful territory, and their children played together, and their parents shared labor at harvest, and they looked after each other the way communities do when they have learned that the alternative is worse. Horace Finch retired from the general store in 1890 and sold it to his nephew, a young man from Phoenix who had ideas about expanding the stock to include ready-made clothes and who was intimidated by Mabel in the most productive way, meaning that he kept his prices honest. The old store cat had long since been replaced by the cat's daughter, who had the same calm proprietary attitude toward the counter, and who accepted Thomas's periodic attempts to pet her with patient resignation. Mabel's 40 acres continued to be worked. The cabin on that land had become, over the years, a place where Marcus Webb lived, paying a modest rent that Mabel put directly back into maintaining the property. This arrangement suited everyone. Marcus was a good tenant and a reliable hand, and was, by 1890, walking out with the older Garcia daughter, Elena, in a manner that had reached the stage where everyone could see where it was going except possibly Marcus himself. One afternoon in the fall of 1890, when Thomas was 5 and Clara Rose was a year and a half, and had recently decided that the most interesting place to be at any given moment was wherever you least wanted her, Mabel was sitting at the kitchen table writing letters, a habit she had developed since the territorial newspaper days. And Raymond came in from the yard and sat down across from her and looked at her with that particular quality of attention that she had never tired of in 7 years. "What?" she said, without looking up from her letter. "Nothing," he said. "I am just looking at you." She finished the sentence she was writing and then looked up. He was doing exactly what he had said, just looking at her with an expression that was fond and warm and entirely direct. "You are going to make me unable to concentrate," she said. "I doubt that," he said. "You have the most formidable concentration of any person I have ever known." She put down her pen. "What is it?" she said, because she knew him and she could hear something underneath the ordinary. He was quiet for a moment. "I was riding the east boundary this morning," he said. "The long way, past the cedar brake and down to the creek fork on your land. And I stopped there for a while, and I was thinking about 7 years ago when I first rode over to check if the storm had done damage, and I was thinking about all the distance between that morning and this one." He looked at her. "I am grateful every day," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever else I do or do not say, I want you to know that every day I am aware of what I have and I do not take it for granted." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window, and it was on his face, on the lines that the years and the weather had put there, on the gray that was beginning at his temples, on that jaw that she had thought, the first day she saw him, looked like it had been carved out of something hard. "I know," she said. "I know you don't." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Neither do I." He turned his hand and held hers. They sat in the kitchen of their house in the afternoon light, while somewhere outside Thomas was engaged in some project involving a great deal of noise, and Clara Rose was conducting her usual investigation of anything that could be investigated. And the land spread out in every direction the way land does, heedless and ancient and entirely indifferent to the lives being built on it. And Mabel Bell Graves, who had once stood over her mother's grave and told herself she did not believe in love, sat with her hand in the hand of the man who had given her every reason to start, and she believed in it completely and without reservation, and with every part of herself that had ever been broken, and every part that had never been touched, and every part that was still becoming. And she was, in that moment, in that kitchen, in that life, fully and entirely herself, which was the only thing she had ever truly wanted to be. Outside, the late October sun was laying itself across the red Arizona land in long gold bars, and the cedars in the breaks were doing their dry, fragrant thing in the afternoon wind. And Dusty's replacement, a young mare named Belle, was standing at the fence with her ears forward as Thomas ran past, and in the bunkhouse Marcus Webb was likely still not quite understanding that he was going to marry Alina Garcia, and in the town of Calico Creek, Horace Finch was sitting outside his former store and enjoying his retirement with the cat's daughter on his knee, and the territory was going about its ancient business of being large and hard and beautiful, and the two people at the kitchen table were going about theirs, which was this: the quiet, extraordinary daily work of a love that had been built honestly and maintained faithfully, and had turned out to be not what Mabel had feared at all, but something else entirely. Something that had not diminished or destroyed but had only ever added. Had added Raymond and Thomas and Clara Rose and Pete's rocking chair and rabbit stew and vegetable gardens and church dances and letter campaigns and fence posts and all of it. The whole accumulated beautiful weight of a life shared with someone who had looked at her and seen exactly who she was and had asked for nothing more and nothing less than just to be beside her. And she had said yes. Obviously yes. And she had been right. Thomas grew into a boy of 6, then 7, who loved the land the way children love things they have known since before memory, not with sentiment but with the deep bodily familiarity of a creature in its element. He followed his father on horseback checks of the cattle in the mornings, and he followed his mother through the fields in the afternoons, and he filed away everything both of them showed him with the serious competence that Mabel recognized as her own practicality applied to a child's scale. He was not a particularly gentle boy, not rough either, just thoroughly himself in the way that children are when they have not been discouraged from it. Clara Rose, at 2, was a person of extraordinary seriousness and complete physical fearlessness, a combination that kept both her parents at a sustained level of alert. She climbed things that were not intended to be climbed. She investigated the henhouse with a scientific thoroughness that the hens did not appreciate. She brought stones to the dinner table to show her father, and he looked at each one with the same genuine attention, because that was the kind of father Raymond Graves was. In the winter of 1891, a letter arrived from Mabel's sister Clara. Mabel had written to Clara twice a year since coming to Calico Creek, short factual letters that communicated her whereabouts and her well-being without intimacy, because the intimacy between them had been severed in stages over the years of Clara's difficult marriage and Mabel's solitary life. The letters from Clara in return had been infrequent and carefully worded, the letters of a woman managing her words around the presence of someone who read her mail. This letter was different. It was long and it was unguarded, and it had clearly been written in one sitting without revision. Clara's husband had died in the fall of a fever quickly. Clara was a widow with 2 children of her own, living in Tucson in the house that was too large and too expensive for a woman without income, and she was asking, with the particular careful asking of someone who has spent years not asking for anything, if there might be something for her in Calico Creek. Mabel read the letter twice and then went to find Raymond, who was in the barn, and she gave it to him to read, and he read it and handed it back and said, "Do you want her here?" She thought about it carefully and honestly, the way she did all hard things. "Yes," she said. "I think she needs to get out of that house, and I think she has spent a long time in a life that was not the right shape for her, and I think she deserves a chance at something different." "Then write to her and tell her to come," he said. "We can make the cabin on your land fit for a family with 2 children. It will not take long." She looked at him. "You are sure?" "She is your sister," he said, as if that settled it. She wrote the letter that evening. Clara arrived in March of 1892 with her 2 children, a boy named William, who was 8, and a girl named Eliza, who was 5, and the look on Clara's face when she arrived, stepping down from the stage in front of the Calico Creek post office, and standing in the sharp, clean spring light with her children beside her, was the look of a person who has been somewhere very dark and has come back to the world and is still not entirely sure it is real. Mabel met her at the stage. They had not seen each other in 9 years. They stood for a moment and looked at each other, and then Clara started to cry, quietly and without drama, and Mabel put her arms around her sister and held her, and did not say anything, because she had learned, in these years of building a life she trusted, that some things did not require words. The cabin on Mabel's 40 acres was refitted, quickly, and with the help of Marcus Webb, who was by this time finally engaged to Elena Garcia, and who threw himself into the project with the energy of a man who has decided to be useful as a general policy. It was not a large cabin, but it was solid and clean, and had more comforts than it had when Mabel first arrived, and Clara settled into it with her children with something that grew gradually, week by week, into the quality of safety. William and Thomas became inseparable with the efficiency of boys near the same age thrown together in a place with room to run, and Eliza and Clara Rose studied each other for approximately 1 week, and then formed an alliance based on shared interest in the world's smaller creatures, specifically insects and lizards, which none of the adults had anticipated but all of them found acceptable. Clara herself took to helping Mabel with the fields, and she was stronger than she looked after years of running a house largely on her own, and she was a quick learner, and she had, it turned out, a particular gift for the kitchen garden that had always been a secondary concern of Mabel's. By the summer of 1892, the kitchen garden behind the main house was producing abundantly under Clara's management, and Raymond had suggested, with the careful neutrality of a man making a practical observation, that it might be worth selling the surplus to Horace's nephew at the store. And Clara had looked at him with the expression of someone who has just been handed something she did not know she was allowed to want, and said, quietly, that she thought she might like to try that. She did try it, and it worked. Not grandly, not immediately, but steadily, the way things work when a person applies consistent attention and honest effort to them, which Mabel recognized as her own way of working, and which she thought Clara had always had in her, and had simply never been given the conditions to use. By the time the summer of 1893 arrived, Mabel Bell Graves was 31 years old, and the woman she had become was in every way a fuller version of the woman she had intended to be when she rode into Calico Creek 10 years earlier. She had her land and her farm and her mind and her independence, and she had Raymond and Thomas and Clara Rose and Clara and William and Eliza and Marcus and Elena, and every family in the collective and the Calico Creek community, and Pete Dunbar's rocking chair on the porch, and the mornings riding the boundary with the early light coming up over the mountains, and the evenings with a full table, and the nights with Raymond beside her. And the life she had built was larger and more complex and more beautiful than anything she had planned for, and she had planned for exactly this. Something that was hers, that no one had given her and no one could take away, that she had made with her own hands. And her own courage and her own willingness, finally, to stop being afraid of the right things. On a September evening in 1893, she was sitting on the porch in Pete's rocking chair when Raymond came out and sat in his chair beside her, and Thomas came up from the yard with a stone he had found, and he held it up for her to see, and it was an ordinary piece of red Arizona sandstone, not remarkable in any way, but she took it from him and turned it in her hand and said, "It is a good stone, Thomas," and meant it, because she had learned that this was the real work. The daily honest attendance to the small things that were actually everything. The sun went down over the desert in the colors that only Arizona produces, the impossible reds and oranges and a deep living purple over the mountains. And Thomas ran back to the yard, and Raymond reached over without looking and took her hand and held it the way he had held it for 10 years, carefully and warmly and with absolute certainty. And Mabel Bell Graves sat in the rocking chair a good man had made for her, and rocked slowly, and watched the sky go dark above the land that was hers. And she was home, entirely and irrevocably home, and she had been right to start believing, and she would go on believing for the rest of her life.